everyone, and welcome to a new video. Today's video is going to be very casual and a bit old-fashioned for this channel. I'm just going to be making a blouse from a 1940s pattern using a 1970s fabric and talking you through the process. I don't know how interesting this will be for more experienced seamstresses, but I will try and share some tips and tricks when it comes to following patterns and constructing blouses along the way, so perhaps it will be enjoyable regardless. And this project was motivated primarily because I purchased this material that I just thought was fantastic. I got this from a sales group on Facebook, and it's from the 1970s, and it's a cotton, and it's covered with sporting dogs, and also guns and pheasants, because the majority of sporting dogs were gun dogs, or retrievers. So it has Springer Spaniels on it, and Irish Setters, and Pointers, and some of these dogs look very similar to my dogs, who I love dearly. The fact that it was vintage, it was fabric, and it had dogs on it was like three things that I just adore coming together, and I thought I would turn it into a garment that I would love and get a lot of wear out of, that was really versatile despite the slightly unusual print. So I turned it into a blouse, and I really hope you enjoy seeing the process. I try to write notes on where my patterns come from and when I purchased them, just because it's interesting to look back on, and if they end up in someone else's hands in the future, I think it's interesting for them to look back on too. So this came to me from a lot of 800 from Pennsylvania in mid-2021. I've not counted it. It is in worse for wear shape, which is part of the reason I decided to keep it for myself. And I'm quite curious to get it opened up and see what condition the pieces are in and if all of the pieces are there. We have instructions at least, which is nice, and there's definitely some tissue in here. The back of this envelope says that there are supposed to be 11 pieces, so I'm just going to count the number of pieces of tissue that are here. That isn't guaranteed that all of the pieces belong to this pattern, but it will give me some hope to start with. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then 10, 11 are folded together. So there are 11 pieces here, which is awesome. And some of them appear to be uncut, which I wasn't expecting given the condition of the envelope. And the tissue itself looks to be in really great condition. So it just goes to show that you should never judge a pattern by its cover, because sometimes the pieces inside of it are still in pretty great shape. So I'm going to figure out which view I'm making and then pull out the pieces that correspond with it and get them pressed. I also have to get my fabric pressed, and then I will be ready to get started. Alright, so everything is cut out, and the next step is just going to be clipping the notches. As you can see, I cut this out with normal scissors, but I did make a few additions to the pattern. I added a 1/2 inch to the bottom edge of the sleeves and 1 inch to the sides because I want to let the sides out by a 1/2 inch, and I also want to sew it closed with French seams, which requires an additional 1/2 inch seam allowance. For the sides of the back and front panels, I added 1 inch as well to account for that additional seam allowance, as well as the additional room in the bust, because this is made for a 34-inch bust, and I have one that is slightly larger than that. I also added a 1/4 inch on the fold of the back, so there will be a little bit more room across the shoulders too, which I think I will end up needing. I added a 1/2 inch to the shoulder seams, not to make them bigger, but to account for the French seams I would like to sew them with. And then perhaps most importantly, I guess, I added 1 inch to the front edge, which is the facing that flips inward and hides the interior of the buttonholes, because I'm pretty sure this demands bound buttonholes, and they usually cut it pretty close in terms of how much folds inward and how much extends past the edge of the bound buttonholes. So I just wanted to give myself a little bit of extra room there. With everything cut, I can go through and cut the notches, which are pretty crucial when you're fussing around with facings and collars and whatnot. Then I'm going to go through and mark all of the tucks. I'm not sure if I'm going to use chalk or a water-soluble marking pen or a crayon. It sort of just depends what shows up best on this fabric. Everything is going to be marked on the interior, so it's not crucial if it washes out, it just can't bleed through. When you end up making all of these additions, it's much harder to position the tissue back on the fabric to mark the necessary points, because the edges of the tissue don't line up with the edges of the fabric. So that is something to keep in mind. And this is sort of a tricky fabric to mark things on, because it has dark colors and has light colors, and you really want the markings to show up on all of it. So I think I'm going to end up using this blue sort of waxy pen. Since it's kind of a waxy crayon, it shows up better on dark colors than the water-soluble ink ones that I use, which look like this. Actually, that shows up pretty well too. So that's an option as well. But my waxy one is working fine for now. So there's a large dart at the shoulder. There's also the pocket that I don't have to transfer because I'm not going to be adding it. I think it would look a little bit weird with how heavily printed this fabric is. Next up is marking the tuck below the waist. So I'm just folding the tissue back to allow me to mark the tops, then folding it back once again to mark the bottoms. And then I'll use a ruler to connect those markings. And now I have to mark the buttonholes, and I am also just going to mark the center line where the facing is folded inward, because that can be helpful to have. Tissue will get folded back at that point. Mark another little dot, and there we go. So now the pattern can be removed. I can connect those lines And then I can repeat this for the other panel, except this time I'm just going to be marking where the buttons are sewn on as opposed to where the buttonholes are. So I'm sort of doing a hybrid here. I'm doing the small bow you see with this version, but I'm doing the sleeves you see with this version, but I'm not doing the cuffs. I'm just doing a normal hem. So these sleeves are more tapered, they're narrower near the cuff, and they have gathers at the shoulder, whereas these sleeves have darts at the shoulders, and then they have a proper cuff that turns up, but I don't think that's going to look very good with this fabric, so I'm just going to do a normal hem. But I picked these sleeves because I much prefer the structure that the darts provide. I think back when I was doing sewing through the decades, I followed a pattern like this from the 1940s, and I really liked how it looked. You don't have to fuss around with gathering and easing the top edge of the sleeve. You can just sew the darts and then it fits. So I have all the darts marked. So now I'm just going to press these sleeve pieces because they've gotten a little bit crumpled in storage. And then I'm going to pin all of these so the markings line up. And then I'm going to sew from the raw edge towards the point of each dart. I'm also going to pin and sew all the darts and tucks, and for tucks it's just like sewing a dart, so you crease the fabric so the two markings are together and you pin through both markings, but instead of tapering to a point, you just backstitch where the marking ends. So I have darts on the front panels, tucks on the front panels, tucks on the back panels, and then 8 darts on the sleeves. I probably just showed you a bunch of footage of me doing those steps, but in current times, what I'm actually going to do is make the bound buttonholes first. It's going to be much easier to sew these and press these while the fabric is completely flat, but it will only be before I sew the tucks. So they have bound buttonhole instructions. They say sew a strip 1.5 inches wide and 3/4 of an inch longer than the buttonhole to position right sides together, slash through center and diagonally 2 corners, draw to inside forming an even binding. Sew binding along seam. D shows right side, baste facing to inside, slash facing, and hem. So it actually looks like they want you to top stitch around the buttonhole after it's sewn, which I've never seen before, but I really like that because that's going to secure it in place and you're not depending on hand stitches securing the inner edges to the facing. So I'm really pleased to see that, and that makes me a little bit more optimistic about how these are going to go. Just cut out the pieces for the bound buttonholes, and I fussy cut them out from the portions of the pattern that have bark in them, because I think it's going to look much nicer if all of the buttons have the same color binding as opposed to random limbs of pheasants and dogs. So hopefully this ends up working out how I envision, and I managed to get them lined up so the wood grain is going in the same direction for all of them. So usually we just pin the buttonhole facings on, but I went a step further and basted them because I wanted the wood grain to be going in a specific direction, and when you're sewing from the back side and the facing is on the underside, it can be difficult to make sure that it isn't getting crooked or pleated or anything during the process. So I thought I would just mark the center of each facing and then baste that point to the buttonhole marking on the interior. So now I'm just going to sew around these markings, and then I can get to clipping and pressing. And I don't know what is wrong with my voice. I apologize. I think it's allergies. All right, so now they have been sewn. So I'm going to make a little clip near the center. I'm just going to cut along that marking, and then I'm going to clip towards the corners of the stitching, getting as close as I can to the stitching without cutting through it. And I'm cutting towards the stitching on an angle. Then we are going to bring the facing through to the back side of the fabric. To make this easier for myself, I'm just going to put a pin at the center of the opening where the marking for the buttonhole originally was. I'm going to put this on either side so I have a guideline there. I'm just going to use my finger to press the sides down. Then I'm going to fold the seam allowance down, and I'm going to wrap the facing over top of it, making sure that the fold of the facing is level with those 2 pins, and then I'm going to press it. And then I'm just going to repeat the process with the underside. So I'm going to press the seam allowance upward, then fold the facing over it, and press the fold down. So the fold of the under one should be level with the fold of the top one. And sometimes when you flip it over, it still requires a little bit of tweaking, but it should be relatively level. So what I really like about this method is that it means you get the facing level on both sides every time. It's really, really easy when you're first starting out to get them unlevel. So one will be like 1/8 of an inch thick, and then the other one will be 3/8 of an inch thick. Whereas this way, where you mark the center line using pins, it's really easy to fold it inward exactly where it needs to be. When I first started doing bound buttonholes, I'll show you what I did. So I'd start off the same way by clipping it and then bringing the facing to the inside, but then I would press it like this, and then by eye, I would try and fold the facing inward, and I got them crooked every single time. So one would be folded inward by like 3/8 of an inch, and then the other one would be folded inward by 1/8 of an inch, and it was just such a pain trying to get them level. I'd end up having to redo them a bunch of times. So with this way, I haven't had that issue anymore at all. So once again, I'm just folding the seam allowance down, and I'm folding the facing over the seam allowance so the edges are level with the pins, which are level with where it was originally marked. And then I'm repeating that process with the underside. And for this one, the facing wasn't centered on the marking, so the top doesn't have as much seam allowance as the bottom, but as long as it looks okay from the front, that's fine. That one could use a little bit of adjustment, but it is still much better than I was getting them when I first started. Also, this is a dark spot in the fabric. It's not super skewed there. So now I just have to repeat this 3 more times. Alright, I went through and sewed all of the darts and tucks, and then I just pressed the tucks to one side and I pressed the darts away from the center of the various pieces. So now the darts and the shoulders are pressed. I meant the shoulders of the front panels, but also the shoulders of the sleeves, which now have that really great curvature to them because of the darts. And speaking of the sleeves, I'm going to go ahead and pin up and then sew up the inner seam, the underarm seam, that's what it's called. And I'm going to be sewing this as a French seam. So I'm going to first sew it with the wrong sides facing each other, then trim it down, then press it, then fold and sew it with the right sides facing each other, encasing the raw edge in the seam. So those are now pinned and ready to be sewn. As for the rest of it, I'm going to look at the instructions. I'm probably not going to follow the instructions, but stranger things have happened. So it wants me to join the shoulder seams, and it wants me to do a lapped seam, which is where you fold the edge underneath and then you stitch it atop the other edge. What I'm actually going to do is sew this as a French seam and then just top stitch it down so it looks like a lapped seam. Once that's done, I'm going to be quickly approaching the step where you add the tie to the neckline, which has to be done before the facing can be turned inward. And to do that, I actually have to sew the short tie. So the short tie piece looks like this. It's going to be removed from the tissue, then folded in half. I'm just going to sew across this edge, sew across this edge, and then clip the point and turn it right side out. So I'm going to do that quickly as well. I'm going to be completely honest, I've sort of given up at the instructions at this point, and I say that having read like 2 steps of them. But I've created my ties, which look like this. So they were just seamed around the raw edges, and then the points were clipped and they were turned right side out and pressed. And these are positioned at the neckline. They say to position them as marked, but I don't think it was actually marked. So I'm just going to line it up with the notch that's there, and then it will end at the shoulder seam, which I think will look nice. I did also get the shoulder seam sewn up with a French seam, and then I just top stitched it down to mimic the lap details they wanted. I also sewed up the sides of the sleeves with the French seam, and we'll see more on them later. But for now, I have to get these ties basted in place. Am I actually going to baste them in place? Debatable, but I do have to go over to the sewing machine to sew on the facing, so I could just go ahead and do it while I'm at it. Alright, so those are the ties in place, and basically the facing is going to be folded back and stitched on like this, so then when it's turned right side out, the wrong edges are tucked inward. But to finish off this back section, we have a back facing piece. Now it's surprisingly rare for vintage patterns to include these. They usually had you just hemming this edge and then finishing the back of the neck with bias binding, but I much prefer there being a facing. In fact, when there isn't a facing, I usually end up drafting my own, so I was quite pleased to see this. So my facing piece is going to be sewn on to the front edges of these pieces with a 1/2 inch allowance, and I actually extended the edges of the facing piece a little bit so I had more room to hem them, which means that they are slightly longer than the length of the facing, but it should be fine. So I'm just going to get these sewn on with a 1/2 inch seam real quick, and then I'll be back to get this pinned. Alright, so my dog was barking, so I didn't film it, or I did film it but I didn't talk through it, but I just went ahead and hemmed the outer edge of the facing, both the front and the back facing pieces, and then I folded it inward on the line that I marked earlier that marks where the facing folds inward. I just pinned the top edge of the facing to the top edge of the bodice. Then I got it sewn on, and I actually sewed it on twice because the first time the edges weren't lined up properly, so it didn't end up being even. Now I'm just going to go ahead and clip the front corners, just the excess seam allowance out of the way. I'm also going to clip the entirety of the seam allowance down to about 1/4 inch so it'll turn inward more smoothly. And I'll take this over to my ironing board and get it pressed, but there's actually one more thing that I want to clip first, and that's the facing for the buttonholes. So I don't want any of the facings for the buttonholes to extend past that line I've marked, which is where the facing folds inward, because then they will get folded inward and you might end up seeing them peeking through the buttonhole. So I'm just going to trim the edge of the facings down, making sure they still sit about 1/4 inch past where the buttonhole ends. So I have lots of room to tuck the facing around them. I just don't want them to interfere with that edge. Now I'm just going to give this a quick press. Alright, we are at the ironing board. I'm just using my tailor's board and pressing the seam. So this way, when it is folded inward, I know it's being folded inward right at the seam point. And when it comes to pressing the points, I'm just going to match the point up with the point of my tailor's board, which is one of the handy things about tailor's boards. And then I can press the point to be nice and sharp. So now we can go ahead and get the tailor's board out of there, and the facing should just want to fold inward at the seam point. And it should also naturally want to fold inward on that line that we marked much earlier. And now I'm just pressing around the neckline. Okay, I'm just thinking that I should have understitched this and then it would have been much more prone to staying turned inward, but it's fine. I think I'm actually just going to top stitch this edge down a 1/4 inch away from the edge. I've done that on 1940s blouses before, so I know it isn't unheard of. And I also think it will mimic the top stitching around the shoulder nicely. So I'm going to do that by machine. Then on the interior, I'm going to be stitching it down the folded edge of the facing by hand. So we'll get to that in a moment, but first just some top stitching around the perimeter. All right, so the top stitching is now done, and now it's time for my least favorite part of the bound buttonholes. It's not actually sewing the bound buttonholes, it's sewing the facing to the interior of the bound buttonholes. So now that the facing is turned inward, obviously the buttonholes are blocked by it and they won't function. So what I have to do is slash the facing through the opening in the buttonhole and then clip outward from that point and turn the edges inward to create a nice finished folded edge around each edge of the buttonhole. It's more tedious and annoying than sewing the buttonholes themselves, and mine always end up looking really wonky. So I'm not looking forward to it, but that is what I'm going to do. And then once that's done, I'm going to go around and just stitch down the entire outer edge of the facing. They don't usually tell you to do this, but I find floppy facings really annoying. It bothers me when you wash something and the facing gets flipped outward and then you have to press it down. I just much rather sew it from the get-go and then not have to do as much garment maintenance later on. So I'll do that with whip stitches, and I'll probably use slip stitches around the buttonholes. Okay, so I have created these slashed little openings for all of my buttonholes. So now they're functional again. And I've also pinned the entire inner edge of the facing inward. I did go ahead and hem it off camera. Can't remember if I filmed that. And then I pressed it and I just made sure to smooth it out from both the front and the underside before I sew it down. Because especially at the back, sometimes you can end up getting lumps or wrinkles that you permanently sew in place after stitching down the inner edge of the facing. So I want to avoid that. And I think while I'm hand sewing, I'm also going to hem the sleeves. So using my iron, I've turned the bottom edge inward by a 1/2 inch, and then just by hand, I'm going to turn it inward by another 1/2 inch and just whip stitch that edge down. Again, I'm doing a hybrid version of the sleeve. This sleeve is supposed to have cuffs, but I didn't think that would look right. And I'm assuming they just want you to do a narrow hem on the sleeves if you don't do that, but as I said, I'm not really reading the instructions. I'm being rebellious in my own little way. So now I just have a bunch of hand sewing to do, and I have a tip for you. If you're going to be doing a lot of hand sewing, get yourself one of these wrist pads. I will link the one I have down below. I'm forgetting what they're called, but they're basically for when you're on your computer to rest your wrists on. And they're really, really great for hand sewing too. They just provide a little bit of cushion that's a lot more comfortable than the table. So if you've ever seen this in my videos, that's what it is. It's also a really great surface for putting beads on because they don't roll around. So it's dual purpose. And it really does make a difference just in terms of comfort, especially if you have a lot of hand sewing to do. So I guess while I hand sew my dog blouse, I'll give you a dog update. We got some snow, which was fun because Minnie's never seen snow before, and she was quite delighted by it. Posey gets really frisky and playful when it snows, so they did a lot of wrestling in the snow, and then Posey was so exhausted afterwards that she slept on my lap, which she never does. Tennis continues to be Minnie's favorite thing in the entire world, and when I say tennis, I mean me using a tennis racket to hit tennis balls for her because I am terrible at throwing them. Now that the weather is getting nicer, I think I'm going to get back into doing nose works with Posey, which is where you put various scents in a tin and then hide it for them, and then they have to sniff it out and they get a treat. Minnie has done a couple naughty things recently, including finding a dead squirrel and refusing to give it up and trying to bring it inside the house. She also found a mole, and I say found, but I mean she probably killed it, and she brought that inside into her crate and didn't want to give that back either. Alarmingly, her favorite current toy too is this little stuffed beaver, which is the exact same size as a foal and has a similar limpness quality. And she will just carry it around her mouth and chew on it and squeak it. And it is very disturbing after you've seen her do the same thing with a real, live, no longer alive animal. One of the super cute things she did recently, though, was she was out in the yard without me and she managed to lose her collar, but she lost it in the yard, and since it's such a big yard, I couldn't find it. And the next morning, she brought the collar back to me. I went to let her inside and she had brought the collar back up onto the deck. I was just astounded and amazed and so impressed, and she got lots of praise for that. Posey continues to be just the best dog in the world for me. She is so calm and lazy. She just likes to sleep and eat, which I deeply relate to. And then she has little spurts of energy where she wants to play. And I just love her so much. But I don't have a lot of fun stories about her because she really is just a lump most of the time. But I mean that in the best possible way. I don't know if I have any exciting life updates about me. I think I'm going to film another video soon where I talk a little bit about my mental health, which has been absolute garbage this year, which has really contributed to the lack of content. But then again, I'm not even sure if I have a lot to say about that aside from the fact that my mental health has been garbage. But I do have a few more elaborate things that I'm working on and I'm excited about. I've also picked up knitting. That's sort of my new hobby of the new year. And as per usual with me, when I get into a hobby, I get really into it. So I've purchased more yarn than I would care to admit and more patterns than I'd care to admit. And if you'd like to see videos on those, let me know. And then I could write yarn off as a business expense, which would be great because I've spent so much money on yarn. The annoying thing about it though is that I'm quite impulsive when it comes to taking on projects, and that works well with sewing because I have so much fabric. So sometimes I have to alter my vision to work with materials I have on hand, but if I have a project idea, I can usually get started on it with some of the materials I have. Or I can at least get started creating a pattern for it and draping it and doing fittings with muslin while I wait for the fabric to arrive. And with knitting, you can't really do that. So there were a few days where I was feeling really motivated to knit and I just didn't have the right size of needles or the right size wool. So I decided I wanted to invest in building somewhat of a stash of wool. But like with many things, once you start buying it, it is hard to stop. And there's so many pretty wools out there. So perhaps I will do a haul with those because I've collected quite a few. Now my hems are sewn, so I am at the ironing board and just going to give those a press. And pretty soon we can get these sleeves sewn on, which I am dreading. Though dreading slightly less than usual because the darts should make them fit much better than fussing around with gathers. Before I press the facing, I did just want to point out that if you follow their instructions, the second step is joining the underarm seams. And I'm pretty sure I've said this in every video on making a blouse ever, but in case you're new here, I'm going to say it again. It is so much easier to install the collar and the facing and everything like that if you leave the side seams until later on. Unless it's a really strange pattern, there usually isn't a reason to do up the side seams before those things. Since the side seams aren't done up, I can lay the bodice completely flat and really thoroughly press it and get that front edge and the buttonholes and everything looking nice and sharp. So that's what I'm going to do right now. And as you can see, there are no ripples. The facing isn't forcing the outer layer of fabric to sit any way other than the way it wants to, which is flat. Alright, so now I'm going to go ahead and sew up the side seams. And I guess, once again, in case you're new here, I will film this part. So I'm going to sew these together with French seams, which means I'm first going to be sewing the pieces together with a 1/2 inch allowance with the wrong sides facing each other. So I'm going to do that really quick. And now my sewing machine is on, so I apologize for the background noise, but I just sewed that with a 1/2 inch allowance, and I sewed from the underarm to the hem because I ended up adding a little bit to the hem just by eye, so I knew they might not line up perfectly, so I wanted any excess material to be there instead of at the armhole. Where I have to set the sleeve and it's just a little bit more precise. So now I'm going to go ahead and trim that seam allowance down to a little less than a 1/4 inch. And the reason we don't just sew this as a 1/4 inch seam right off the back is because the fabric frays as you handle it and use it. So you want to cut off any frayed edges because those threads could potentially poke out of the seam. Then I'm going to press the seam flat, and then I'm going to fold the fabric on the seam line and press it again. So the seam line is at the center of the fold, or the fabric is folded on the seam line. And then I'm just going to sew it with another 1/2 inch allowance. So that looks like so. And now I'm going to press that edge to the back of the garment. And we have what looks like a normal seam from the outside, but it neatly encases all of the raw edges on the interior. So now I'm going to repeat this on the other side and then probably just do a narrow hem along the bottom edge. And I might clip it with pinking shears first because we have some frayed edges. So much like with the French seams, I don't want that to stick out at the finished edge. So I would just go ahead and trim them before I sew it. Okay, so I just finished sewing up the side seams and I also sewed the hem. I used my iron to turn the bottom edge inward by a 1/4 inch, and then I was going to turn it inward by another 1/4 inch and stitch it down. But I remembered I added that extra hem allowance, so I decided to go crazy and do a 1/2 inch hem. And I sewed this by machine because I would only wear this blouse tucked in, so you're not going to end up seeing the bottom edge. So now the next step, and the almost final step before sewing on buttons, is sewing on the sleeves, which I'm not particularly excited about. So I'm probably going to film this process and then speed it up so you don't hear my complaining. But this process should be pretty straightforward as long as they fit the arm side properly. It's just going to be lining up the underarm seams and then matching up the notches and then sort of easing the sleeve material to the arm side at the shoulder. and we'll see how it turns out. Oh, and then it will be stitched on with a 1/2 inch allowance, and then I will stitch a 1/4 inch away from that stitching and use pinking shears to clip the seam allowance relatively close to that second line of stitching. I again have not read the instructions, but this isn't an uncommon finishing. The second line of stitching prevents the seam allowance from fraying past that point and potentially becoming problematic as the garment's worn. So that went surprisingly well. I actually ended up sewing them on with 3 rounds of stitching. So I did the first one a 1/2 inch away from the edge, and then I removed the pins and just leveled the edge because there were a few points where the edges of the sleeve piece and the arm side weren't perfectly level. So I just clipped them to be level. Then I sewed it on with another 1/2 inch seam allowance, this time away from the newly trimmed edge. Then I stitched a 1/4 inch away from that line of stitching and just trimmed the excess with pinking shears. And then I used my ham to get them nice and pressed. So the next step is going to be shoulder pads. I did briefly try this on and it's almost too tight in the shoulders. So I'm really glad that I added that extra 1/4 inch at the back. I probably even could have added an extra 1/2 inch at the back. Their instructions for the shoulder pads are fold a 7 inch by 7 inch square in half, inserting cotton batting and thinning it out towards the points. Turn in edges and slip stitch. Tack pad to shoulder and armhole seam. This is my preferred way to make shoulder pads, but also means I have to find cotton batting in my closet of horrors. So I'm going to go do that and then I will return. Alright, so I have my shoulder pad pieces. I have the 7 inch squares cut. And I'm not going to be slip stitching the edges by hand. I also cut out a 6 inch square and a 5 inch square of batting. So I'm going to put these sort of centered like so. And then I'm going to put the smaller one in the center of the larger one, like so. I'm just going to take a ruler and mark a line from one corner to the other across the batting. Now I'm just going to sew by machine across that line using relatively large stitches. Alright, now I'm going to fold across that line so the outer edges of the cotton are even, and then I'm just going to pin around the edges, and by machine I'm going to stitch a 1/2 inch away from the edge and then a 1/4 inch away from the edge. Okay, so here they are, and I'm just going to give the edges a trim using pinking shears to level them off. And there are 2 beautiful shoulder pads. As for positioning these, I'm just going to fold them in half and mark the center point along the straight edge. And I'm going to align that with the center of the shoulder, which is right here. And that point is going to get tacked to the seam allowance. And then I'm just going to make sure when it's folded in half, it sort of runs parallel to the shoulder seam. And then the point is going to get tacked as well. And if you want, you can tack down these ends too, but they should sort of naturally go where they're supposed to when it's worn. It's really just the center that I find needs to be tacked. Alright, the shoulder pads I tacked in place, and I think for this I want to use coverable buttons. I'm just not sure what else is going to look great. And I know I have a size between these two somewhere, but I cannot find them, which is really, really frustrating. So I'm going to try and make the smaller ones work. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to fussy cut out the bird heads and try and get a bird head centered on every button. If this works, I will film the process of doing at least one of them, and if it doesn't, I might delete this clip and find different buttons instead. So I dug around in my button box. I managed to find that in-between size I was looking for. This size is 23mm / 7/8 of an inch. And what I did is I just cut out squares of the birds that I wanted to be at the center of each button, and then I took the little button form pattern and made sure the center hole, which is what the button will actually show, it'll be on the front of the button and the rest will be tucked underneath it, was centered around the bird head, and then I traced around that and got them cut out. Now typically to create a covered button, you would put that little circle you cut out in here, you'd put the front of the button, the little cup-shaped piece on top of that, then you'd fold the edges over the cup-shaped piece and put on one of the backings. But because I wanted the bird head to be perfectly centered, it's sort of hard to do that just by pushing the little circle of fabric in here. So I ended up actually positioning the material where I wanted over the buttons and then using basting stitches to secure all of the ends together on the back. So now the portion that displays won't budge. And I started just by doing one of these as a test and it worked. So now I can go ahead and do the others. As you can see, they all have the backs basted together. So now I can just pop the front in there, put the backing on, and then there's this little plastic piece that goes on top of that, and you use pressure to push all the layers together. I can't actually put enough pressure on this while it's on top of this fuzzy thing, so I will do it off camera. But once all the layers have been set together, you can just push it out, and then you have a beautiful bird button with the loop on the back. So now I just have to repeat that a few more times. Alright, so there are my buttons, and I'm going to alternate the different types of pheasant heads. and get them sewn on to the points that I originally marked on the fabric way earlier on. The buttons were sewn on off camera, and that is pretty much it. So that is it for this video, and I'm going to include some more photos. I ended up pairing this with a pencil skirt and a vest that I made from a Simplicity pattern, and a video about that should be out at some point in the future. I really like how this blouse turned out. The fit is excellent. I'm really happy with the alterations I made to give the breadth I needed over the shoulders to have a good amount of mobility. It's just a very nicely proportioned, very nicely fitted, well-made pattern. I really don't have anything bad to say about it, except for the fact that making bound buttonholes sort of sucks. I haven't made a lot of 1940s things recently because I feel like the more tailored style is a little bit too formal to go with the funky hair colors I've been sporting, but this really revived my love for it and served as a reminder for how flattering and lovely these garments can be. So maybe I'll make more of them and add more to my wardrobe and film the process. So if you're interested in seeing that, then you should subscribe and stay tuned. And if you enjoyed this one, then giving it a comment would really help me out. Before I go, I do just want to give a huge thank you to all of my wonderful patrons who make videos like this one and all my other content possible. I'll have a whole bunch of their names on screen, but I wanted to give a special shout out to my top tier patrons who are Jamie Dennett, Remy S., Mary Kinsey, Wendy Nickerson, Vida Terramena, Heidi Nizer, Ezra Hargrave, and Jordan Carpenter. Truly, thank you so much for your support, and I will talk to all of you very soon.